Hello and welcome. You're listening to episode number 4 of Fablebreakers. Today our guest is Aimee Meester, a sci-fi fanatic, a storyteller, and a fellow podcaster.
Our focus for this discussion is going to be storytelling that can make a difference. Aimee is going to talk with us about the inspiration for her projects and how convictions can make or break a story.
My name is Jake Romano.
And I'm Carly Racklin.
And we're here to take the myth out of making something meaningful.
Anything that's scary.
Oh, have you seen that one? Carly, do you know which one
I'm talking
about?
Those are the only Doctor Who episodes I've seen, the scary ones. The Weeping Angel ones, the Silence in the Library. Oh, and the Vincent van Gogh one, because art.
Yep, River's one of my favorite characters. But we don't need to talk about me. That's okay. We're here for you, Aimee.
Okay.
Carly, start us on with the first question here.
Okay. Well, so you listened to our last episode, and in that, Tori said, she brought up this idea that, storytelling can be, a dangerous weapon. So, Have you experienced a piece of media, whether that's a painting or a movie or a book or anything, that changed your mind about something, maybe changed the way you see yourself? Was there a kind of turning point where you realized that media had this power to affect people?
Oh, man. Yes. I'm going to talk about the first one that comes to my head, which is a pretty recent one, but I think it kind of changed a lot of how I'm now approaching what I want to do with writing and art and myself, and that is Rogue One, a Star Wars story.
I knew you were going to bring it up.
There we go. That is one of my favorite all-time stories now, I would say. And I've always loved Star Wars, but Star Wars has always kind of been the Jedi and the Force have saved the galaxy. And it's just been this huge, sweeping, kind of mystical thing. Mm-hmm. And then I like that. I love that. But I always had a hard time connecting to that. And I always just felt like it was too big for me. And then I saw Rogue One. And Rogue One is all about the ordinary people who do what they can. And they do it in their own way. And they're very important. I'm trying not to spoil it. I won't spoil it. But it was kind of a movie about how ordinary people and ordinary things are very important. And that hit me a lot. I remember just sitting there, crying in the theater, well, snap. Okay. And I guess it kind of put into words and character a lot of things that I had always felt and a lot of things that I had always wanted to do with my own stories. And so that just kind of fit a lot of things into place to me. I'm writing about ordinary people. I am living my life as I don't have to be the Jedi who saves the world. Mm-hmm. I can be the person who uses my skill sets and does good quietly and does it without being this huge force and changes things anyway. And maybe that's the piece that saves everything and nobody knows about it. So that really influenced how I do a lot of things now. And there are more, I'm sure, but that's the one that I can remember, probably because that was recent.
I like what the words you used, Aimee, when you're talking about that, the idea of people doing good quietly, and how it can kind of be the same as those big heroes on the big screen who are doing all this fighting and kind of these world-renowned heroes in this giant, sprawling franchise world and all that, when sometimes that's kind of hard for people to relate to. You know, we're not these intergalactic heroes. We're just little humans who have day jobs and who do all these other things, but do you try to send that kind of message with your writing, that you can do little things and still make big changes?
Oh, absolutely. I've never been the kind of person who's written these big, sprawling, even when I wrote fantasy, it was never this big Lord of the Rings epic fantasy, because I've always just been really interested in just people. And I think that a thing sci-fi can do, if you do it right, I think sci-fi has more benefit when you focus in, when you zoom in not on this huge world around the characters, but on the characters and on the people who operate in this world. When the setting is not a character itself, but it's just the background for people living their lives. Star Trek does a great job of that, of kind of zooming in. So yes, things like that, and that is definitely what I try to do. I've always found myself writing pretty ordinary people, and it's always more about the people themselves than about the world they happen to be in, which happens to be weird most of the time if it's me. So
Cool.
yes, that definitely influences a lot, and Rogue One, kind of helped me realize that, because I've always done that, but I didn't realize it until recently.
Yeah, it's people
cool.
are gonna. I mean, people like to see those big, huge battles and these kind of epic things that can't happen in real life. But I do think that, especially with something like Rogue One, where you have characters sacrificing, sacrificing different things and maybe compromising, like those are really the things that we're looking at. And we're saying, those are the things we're going to connect to, because we can't connect to necessarily these huge epic things that are happening, but we can look at the humans and say, well, these are human decisions that they're making. And I think probably the more interesting than those epic fights are those little moments where you have a sacrifice or a compromise that needs to be made, and you say, that's where you're connecting emotionally, and you're saying, wow, I felt that. I understand what they're going through, and this is a character that doesn't even exist. So that's a really cool. Those moments are always really neat, very cool. Yeah.
Right. I think you can make those. Like, I love big space battles, and like the big final showdown, and I love those. And I think those are most effective when you've spent most of the story building up the character. Because we love to see big space battles. Like, I love the final battle scene in Rogue One. I love it even better because I'm attached to the people beforehand.
And there was so much at stake.
People with guns. It's, I care about those people with the guns. Yeah. And I have a reason for wanting them to win, so.
Made it much more tense.
Cool.
Yeah. So along the same vein of storytelling, because that's kind of our fable, our topic for today, is how storytelling really can help to change people's minds. I really believe that. Carly has said in the past, it teaches us how to live. It gives us something to look at. Some people are making these decisions. They're fictional, and it really does affect how we make our decisions. It's very subliminal, but I think it really is powerful. And I think that intentional creating makes a much more meaningful creation for both the creator and the audience who will interact with the finished product.
Yes.
That's why we talked about the turning point that you had kind of with Rogue One, and how that was a turning point for you. You something changed in your mind about the way you create. Usually behind that focused intent in creation, we find convictions. A writer that's convicted will usually create something that's more powerful. We want to know what the relationship is like between the material that you create and your own convictions. I'm sure there's probably some sort of strong relationship there, right?
Yeah, most of the time I think that my convictions and the things I'm feeling very strongly about, or the things that I believe, they're kind of fueling me, and I don't always realize that. And sometimes I'll finish a piece and I'll look back at it and I'll be like, oh, I was really frustrated with this at this time in my life. And so there are some things that are constant, that I've always felt really, really strongly about. And obviously my faith is one of those things, and kind of things that I'm struggling with and learning about that tend to bleed into whatever I'm working on. Whatever's creating really strong emotion in me tends to kind of bleed in whether I want it to or not. So faith is a big one. I have always, not to get too depressing here, but I have always had a lot of mental health struggles, and that has always been really hard for me. That's something I've grown up with and dealt with. It's something that's gotten worse over the past few years. Sometimes it's better, sometimes it's not. So I've had a lot of insecurities, and I've had a lot of fears, and I've had a lot of feeling like, well, I'm a worthless piece of crap, And so a lot of the time I end up writing things. I have one that I'm working on right now. I have a sci-fi novel. It has turned out to be a lot kind of about how I have dealt with my mental health in the past and my journey through that. And it came from a lot of my feelings of like, well, I don't like how people deal with it in this way, but I also don't like how people approach it in this way. I had a time where I was getting very frustrated because I was looking at a whole group of people who didn't understand this whole mental health thing, and that whole side of like, well, don't talk about it, don't mention it, just get over it, power past it. And there's that group of people. So I think out of that has come, especially in this generation, a lot of like, well, we're going to accept mental health. We're going to work on that. We're going to acknowledge it. Except I think that has almost gone too far. And so that has reached the point where we kind of romanticize it, or we kind of glorify it and treat it less as an actual illness and more as, a thing that is part of who you are, when it's not. It's something that is wrong. And so I kind of was very frustrated with these two sides that were kind of both hitting me all at once. And that was just a really difficult time for me when I was kind of influenced by both sides at once. And so especially the novel that I'm working on now has kind of come out of like, is there a way to balance that? Is there a way to acknowledge it and be honest about it, but also have it be a thing that we can work on? So obviously I don't think I'm doing a perfect job at that, but that is one of the big things that has been kind of a conviction for me lately. Like, I want to acknowledge this in a way that makes sense. I want to do this in a way that I feel like people are not doing it.
You're getting ahead of me here. This is one of my questions for you.
Oh no, I'm sorry.
No, it's awesome. It's so fantastic. You suggested Legion to me, the show Legion, and this.
You watched it?
I loved it.
Yes.
You're talking about broadening kind of the conversation about mental health in media.
Yes.
This show, I think, and this obviously we're not going to talk all about this show. I just loved it a lot, but this show I think did a lot of really interesting things with the discussion about mental health and, how should it be treated? Should we talk about it? Is it something to ignore? Have you seen any other media that gets it right that we should be kind of looking towards as inspiration for this discussion?
Just about mental health?
Mm-hmm. Because it's treated incorrectly. So many, I think people really do mishandle it a lot. And like you said, some people romanticize it. It's not always handled in the best way, I think.
Well, there is a Legion comic.
Okay.
Here is comic book Aimee coming out.
Yay!
That comic, I actually have a poster from it
on
my wall right now. But it is called X-Men Legacy. It's by sci-fi, and that I found that even before I found the show. And that is actually a piece of art that has really influenced me. It kind of, it approaches this character who is a superhero who has these mutant powers, but is also schizophrenic in a very real way. And it also deals with a lot of, the whole depression and anxiety side of things. And I think that comic as a whole, even with superpowers and wild sci-fi and all, it kind of perfectly captures this kind of roller coaster that you go through when you're going through a mental health struggle. Like you have times where you're crushing it and you're beating out the bad guys. And then you have times when you either literally or figuratively like fallen into the void of space. And sometimes it just feels empty, and sometimes it feels kind of like everything is coming at you at once. And I think that really captured that for me, maybe even better than the show did. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But I think the show did a very good job of reflecting that. But that is one I would recommend, even if you don't like comic books normally. I think that's one that's, if you can find it, it's pretty accessible to everybody. And it is one of the very few things that I've found that has gotten that right. I'm trying to think of a book or a movie, but I can't right now.
Well, something really cool about media, and you're talking specifically about comic books, but also movies, is they can explain things visually in a way, something like mental health, which is maybe hard for other people to understand. You think of people like, in our parents' generation where they were just kind of told to suck it up, and they don't really understand how it could be this kind of problem. I think that when we make more of these kinds of shows, and people like you are going to be putting out media that's more easily accessible to people like, our parents, or, people who don't really have to deal with it on a daily basis, I think that's part of you winning. And you're making people understand in a way that they otherwise wouldn't be able to really get it.
Right. I think such a big part of art is somebody sitting down to make something, and then it's kind of just almost a cry for help.
Yep.
And we talk about it a lot, about how art is vulnerable and, says a lot of things, and I really think that's what it is. So a lot of times when you pick up a story, you can realize, like, hey, this is somebody who has really kind of poured their soul into this, and that can help you understand, or maybe, I think more often than not, we identify with a piece of art and we realize, I don't have schizophrenia, but I understand part of what that feels like for that person.
Yep.
And it kind of just broadens the conversation for everybody, which is a great thing.
It's a good thing. Yeah, absolutely. I wish people would talk about it in a better light. I really do. It's a shame that it really isn't. I think it's becoming more like, like you said, more people are talking about it in a light that it's meant to be talked about. We're all good. I lost my train of thought.
I haven't seen Legion, but I've heard about it. And as far as I know, it seems to be the only, mainstream show that I've ever heard of that deals with mental health that's not like a show about a psychiatrist.
Right.
It does a lot of things right. And it's very, very visual heavy. What I liked about it was I looked at it and I was like, yeah, I felt like that. Like, I can't describe some things I can't describe, but I looked at it and I was like, that's exactly what it feels like. It feels like I'm stuck in a coffin, 6 feet underground. And like, it was very visual in that way. I'd recommend it to anyone listening, but also to you, Carly, if you haven't watched it. It's very, it's kind of heavy. It's very heavy. It's a little bit dark, but really deals with things, I think, in a very important light. We wanted to talk a little bit about faith-based media, too, because I know that, because like you said before, faith and your convictions are kind of tied to what you create. And I know you probably have a lot to say about this. I hope you do.
Oh, yes.
My opinion, at least, of faith-based media is that I think they do get a lot of things wrong. And part of this discussion here is to talk about how we can make that more accessible. But I want to hear your thoughts on kind of the Christian media that you've come up against.
Oh man! All right. Time for Amy's opinion.
Yeah,
that's right. Go ahead, Aimee. Fire away.
Yeah. All right. I have been in a Christian house my whole life. I've grown up Christian. I've stayed with that. That's kind of been the environment I've been in. I'm fortunate enough where I grew up in a household where, we're very Christian, but I was allowed to watch and read other things. So I did not, when I was growing up, I didn't have like I wasn't fed a lot of Christian media. It was just kind of good things. But the older I got, the more I kind of started to interact with the media my little subculture was putting out. And the more I started to realize, like, I don't really like any of this. And there's always kind of that guilt that comes with that. Like, well, I really liked this PG-13 superhero movie, but I really hated this, rated PG Christian movie I saw at youth group. And there's kind of that guilt with that. So as I've gotten older, especially being in youth group, I've had a lot of interactions, with Christian movies. I haven't read as many Christian books just because that was never something I was given. But I can just remember reading a few, Christian novels that, people in our family would give us. And it always just felt kind of fake to me. Mm-hmm. I always felt like I was being spoon-fed something that I didn't really want to take, And so for a while I wondered, like, well, maybe I'm just a sinner who's been reading Lord of the Rings exclusively for 10 years. But I think a lot of Christian media tends to be, and you hear this most if you're, like, listening to Christian radio or something. I think that is probably where you'll realize it the most. A lot of it is fake, and I'm hesitant to say that because I've gotten some major hate for that. But so much of it is essentially a youth group sermon that we have kind of packaged up, and maybe like we put them in spaceships, and it's a little bit different. But I've always felt like if you try too hard to say something in the story that you're creating, it's going to be fake, and that applies to Christian media too. You could be saying something perfectly true. You could be sharing a Christian message that is 100% true, but it could still be a very bad story. So I think a lot of my frustration with Christian media comes from the fact that as Christians, we believe in, like, the ultimate creator and storyteller, the person who, like, gave us the words to make the stories. So why are we doing such a bad job of it? Why are we so content with being super mediocre at it? I have heard from so many people like, well, yes, it's a bad story, but it's so much better than everything else out there. No, that is incorrect. I have found more Christian truth in secular stories than I have found in any Christian movie I've ever seen in my life. And I'm sure that there are good ones. I have seen and read some that aren't horrible.
I think people like to bring up probably Narnia as a good example. I mean, I read the Narnia books when I was smaller, and they're allegorical, right? So, like, you have the allegory in there. And probably the problem is that, at least in my experience, is that Christian media is either very exclusive and direct. I think I've used the phrase, like, we pat ourselves on the back a lot with
Yes.
with Christian media, and it's just like, who's going to want to watch this? or on the other end of the spectrum, a story can be so allegorical that some of our conviction gets lost. I mean, we were talking about conviction before. We need to work towards a balance where the story can be more universal without sacrificing those things. And I like how you said you have found, truths, or at least things that that line up with, your truth or your convictions that aren't necessarily even Christian. Switchfoot, I know you love Switchfoot, right?
I love Switchfoot.
I think they probably put out an article or an interview a while ago. They are a Christian band. They don't market themselves necessarily as a Christian group. They market themselves or a Christian, Christian musicians. They market themselves as Christians who are musicians. And I think that little space really does make a difference, especially in their music, because
Yes.
they're not under this pressure to like output something that has this message and it's so saturated. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. I'm going to tell you a joke real
ahead.
fast because while we're talking about Switchfoot,
Oh
there's
gosh.
this joke that goes, basically you go through and you have people list like, well, what's the Christian band equivalent of Miley Cyrus? I don't even remember who it would be. That was a bad example. And then the joke is you get to Switchfoot, and it's what's the Christian band equivalent of Switchfoot? Switchfoot.
Yep.
Sorry,
I've
just
seen
had
that
to say
before.
that because it makes me laugh every time. But yes, continue.
No, I mean, I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that, but like I've always used them as kind of like this example of, I think they do it right. I don't necessarily like listen to a lot of their music as much as I used to, but like I think there's something about that where they're taking their convictions and it's just very natural. They're not. Their music comes from a place of conviction as opposed to this kind of like I need to fill seats, or I need to be putting out
Absolutely.
this certain kind of message. Yeah. So.
Yes, people always use C.S. Lewis or Narnia as an example of, like, well, it's this Christian thing that's really good. And I'm like, yes, but unless you're C.S. Lewis, don't try to do that outward because it's not going to work.
Yeah.
Because C.S. Lewis knew how to do it in a subtle way that was mostly focused on telling a good story.
Mm-hmm.
You probably don't know how to do that because
Yep.
you're not that great.
Yeah.
But yes, another band I would bring up would obviously be 21 Pilots. That's probably the one, and I think most people don't even realize the influence that's in there, but that's such a great example of how I honestly think that our number one focus should be making a good story or making a good piece of art. It should not be making a good Christian piece of art. It should be making a good story. And I really think that if good story, I have this whole flow chart in my head, I guess.
Please
but
give it to us. Give us the flow chart.
All right, the flow
We're
chart.
ready.
So basically, what makes the story good? Good stories are good stories because they tell the truth. If you are writing a good story, you'll be telling the truth. If you believe that the truth is God, if your faith is true, then when you write a good story, you will come to the truth. And I think a great example is the way people have resonated with things like 21 Pilots, even people who don't realize that they're Christians. And I think a big part of that is the fact that they just tell the truth, and you can see something in it. Even if you don't know what it is, you can find the truth in that. And that really hits people. So I think our number one goal should be make a good thing. And if you're focused on making the thing good, that will mean something.
Yeah, I think probably Christian artists are scared of having a broad audience, right? It's like they think that if I have a broad audience, I'm doing something wrong. Like because I think the Christian message. I mean, it can be. It's a very exclusive message, right? So truth can be very exclusive. Truth can be hard to take, but I think, like you said, if you're telling a story that's going to relate to more people, you're not dumbing down the truth, but you're making the truth more accessible to a larger audience, which is so important. Like, let's start doing that, guys, please. Like, can we get on this, right? Like, ASAP. Because so many people look at, and as soon as you label something Christian, I think that automatically turns people off. No matter where you're coming from, whatever things you associate with Christian media beforehand or Christian anything, like automatically when you slap a Christian label on it, like they're going to be turned off. As opposed to coming from the other side of it and just telling something that's like totally honest, like people are going to want to read it. They're going to want to hear what you have to say. Yeah.
And that's the funny thing about it, isn't it? They put so much work into like, well, this is a Christian movie, And then they also try to have this, like, sermon in it. Like, well, nobody's going to hear that sermon who needs it if you slapped this whole label on it. That's not going to do anything. So they want to reach people, but they also want to have their little audience, and that doesn't work. You can't have both.
Yeah, I've had that kind of experience where there are these really big Christian movies and everyone loves them because they're sending this great Christian message, but only Christians are watching it. And those Christians think, oh, it's so great. The message is so great because it's a message they've already accepted.
Yes.
And so I think then it's hard for them to understand this idea of the audience. Like they say they're trying to reach a specific audience with it, but then that audience isn't the one who's getting the message. Or if they do get the message, it's really preachy and not easy to stomach. And that's kind of where one of the big issues lies with this in the audiences that these things are created for. Like,
it's that whole thing, Carly, of like we're patting ourselves on the back, right? So we're making media for ourselves. You know, we're not, you're right. We're not thinking of the audience. We're not thinking of, you know, we're thinking about how it makes us feel when we put it out. Well, at least we did our duty. We made something that's, you know, truthful.
Right.
Yeah. And then when it gets to an audience that's secular or not Christian, they think it's really inorganic and fake, and it doesn't really get the intended effect. But then all the Christians are patting themselves on the back, thinking, "Oh, it was so good." Meanwhile, like all the writers in the room are like, "That wasn't a very good story." But you can't convince the others in the room because, oh, it had this message, but it was so oversaturated. Like Aimee, kind of like you were saying, sometimes even if a story has the right message, even if it's saying something that's totally true, it's just, you know, the seed's not gonna fall on the right soil. It's not made.
Exactly.
It's not made to be stomached by someone who hasn't heard it. I had a metaphor and then it kind of fell away from me.
There is something to be said for quality. Like, you know, truth is important. Like, let's serve it on a gold platter. Like, not just throw it out on paper plates to people. Like, and just because it's truth, they should eat it up. We need to be working on making better stories and better things.
Absolutely.
And, you know, Christians just kind of sit there and, you know, oh, we made the right thing. And, you know, maybe non-Christians are sitting there, like, totally disgusted. And there's no one in between, like, making this better connection. Which is why I'm so glad, Aimee, there are people like you who are sitting here and are ready to rant about this kind of stuff. Because I think people like you are really going to make a difference and make that connection even clearer. So, you go, girl.
I have a question for you.
All right.
So, because now we've talked about this idea of audience, and Christian things are made for Christian audiences, even if they think they're not. Who do you write for? What's your audience? Yeah. You know, what kind of people do you want your stories to go to?
Well, I want to write for people who want to read a good story. Which sounds really like a shallow reason. You know, people are like, I want to write for the people who are lonely. I want to write for, like, all these people, and I'm just thinking maybe it's kind of more shallow, but I just want to write for the people who are going to read it, for the people who want to read a sci-fi book, for the people who want to read a sci-fi book about mental health for whatever reason, you know. I think there's a lack of good stories right now, especially in sci-fi, young adult, and a lot of these little categories. A lack of good stories, of stories that are just
stories for people.
Exactly.
Yeah.
People don't want to read a book that's telling them how they should think. People want to read or watch something that is good, that entertains them. Yep. And it will hit them harder if there's something true in it, if there's something powerful in it. But I'm not perfect at it. I'm still learning. But I have always wanted to just write things that are good, to just write things that people will pick up and like.
I've had those kinds of things where I've been asked in relation to, like, projects I'm working on, like, who should read this? Who's this for? And even though you kind of answered me in maybe a different way than I was expecting, it makes sense now, because now I'm thinking back, like, when I'm asked things like that, who should read this thing, I never think like, oh, this specific person should read this thing. It's more like, this thing should be read by the people who want to read it, you know? There are people who need to hear it.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so I'm writing for those people, whoever they are.
Right.
That kind of goes along with, you know, your question too, Carly, is like, we need to be treating our audiences like they're intelligent, right? Mm-hmm. Instead of saying this is how you should think about this. You're presenting something kind of like Legion does, where you're presenting an idea and you're saying and it's compelling. I'd rather compel an audience than shove it down their throat, right? You're presenting something compelling, and it compels them to make a decision about the problem or the issue that you're presenting, and it makes them want to do something either way, one way or the other. Whether it's yes or no, they're going to say to this problem. You need to make it more compelling. And there are people out there that are intelligent. They're gonna want to hear what you're saying. We got to get to them though somehow, man.
I'm gonna make a weird metaphor here, kind of.
Go for it.
Like with the idea, like you can't, if you try to shove a message down someone's throat, they're gonna throw it back up. So our job as storytellers is not to shove something down someone's throat. It's supposed to compel them to want to consume the message.
Yes.
You have to make it, and that comes along with that whole quality thing. Like how are we presenting it? Are we presenting it as like this thing we're shoving down their throat, or are we really giving them a choice and treating them intelligently? I hope we didn't lose our answer there, Amy. I think Amy answered the question. All right, cool. Yeah. Amy?
Yes.
Can you tell us about your podcast at all?
Yes, I can. Speaking of sci-fi. My podcast is called Bright Eyes. It is a science fiction podcast, which is kind of a thing that not a lot of people are doing right now, but it's becoming more of a thing. I basically, when people ask me, what is this whole fiction podcast thing about, it's basically just a radio drama. It's an audiobook, except all you're getting is the audio, It is about space, obviously. There are spaceships.
We wouldn't want it any other way.
There are aliens. There's a lot of mystery, missing people. I would pitch it probably as, Star Trek meets X-Files, if you had to have a pitch for it. And it is something that I did not expect to be doing, but it happened. And now I have people doing it with me. Now I have people doing all the techie stuff, thank goodness. And it will be out July 10th.
Oh, wow, that's coming up quick, bro.
The first episode. Is it just the first episode?
It is, and then they will be 2 weeks apart.
Cool. Wow.
Yeah, something we should have done. We should have done the 2 weeks thing. What has production been like for you? Because I know you probably have some of your friends doing, like you said, like the sound editing, but also like the voices and stuff. Like that's so fun.
Oh man, yeah.
How did that come about? Like that whole process of getting people together and stuff.
Well, this started out as a novel idea because that's what I do. I write novels. That's all I've done in the past. And then I started to listen to more fiction podcasts. If you want to listen to a fiction podcast, by the way, and you haven't heard Welcome to Night Vale, join the club. That's the one I would recommend. But then I realized, like, hey, this would be kind of a cool way to get into this medium. That would be a neat story. And I was originally going to do all of it by myself. I don't know why. It sounds crazy now because I could not have done that. But that was all I had. So I started writing episodes, and I didn't really have a plan. I didn't know how I was going to make the voices happen. I just started writing it. And a few episodes in, I had been talking about it on Twitter, and somebody messaged me on Twitter and was like, hey, I saw that you're doing this. Me and my brother have been looking to get into this whole podcast thing. Do you need any help? And I was like, yes, I would love some help.
Do I?
So she is now my main voice, actually. Her name is Sydney Fontaine. I love her. She's a darling.
Oh,
and
awesome. I actually follow her on Instagram. That's so funny.
She is my main voice. So she is doing that. And that just kind of happened by accident. She just happened to follow me on Twitter. And she just happens to have a brother who can do all the techie sides of things. So now I write the things and I send it to them. And they record the voice and do the music and the effects and all that magic and send it back to me. And sometimes we fix it a little bit. Most of the time they do a great job and it all sounds lovely. So I can only take credit for the words. That's really all I can do.
It's so exciting to work on such a big project, and collaborating is cool, and I've experienced this with Carly too, because Fablebreakers has been a really I don't want to say life-changing, but it's made me realize that I can do certain things that I didn't think I could do. And I'm sure it's probably been the same for you. And once you complete the project, you're gonna look back and be like, "Whoa! Like I put this together, bro." It's doable. It's not impossible. More people, I think, are putting out podcasts and these bigger projects. And if you have a vision for something, like go out and get it.
Don't let your dreams be dreams.
Just do it.
Just do it. Yeah, right.
My advice to basically add on to that to people would be pretty much what I did. I had the idea. I didn't know if I was going to be able to have somebody do the voice for me. I didn't know how I was going to put it out. I just started writing it. If you have an idea and you want to make it happen, just start. You don't have to have the whole thing planned out beforehand. You just have to start doing it, and sometimes things will fall into your lap out of Twitter, and then you'll be here. So,
well, actually, that leads right in to kind of our final question. So that, I guess, is your advice to people who want to make podcasts. So then what advice would you give to writers, Christians or otherwise, who want to write meaningful stories, but maybe they're afraid of not appealing to a certain audience, or they're worried that they're not sending the right messages, anything like that?
You know what? This is my life motto now. Just do it. Just
do it.
I will tell people over and over and over again, please, 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 do not set out to create a story that matters. Do not start with, I want to write a story about my experiences. Don't do that. Just start out with something you like, with something you're passionate about, and just start writing it. Just start writing it. Do not try to make it matter. Don't try to make it have a good theme. Don't try to make it try to appeal to people. Just do it. Mm-hmm. That will be so much more meaningful. I can promise you. Whenever I try to write something in a way that matters, it falls flat because I'm starting with a sermon and not a story. The goal here is a good story. If your story is good, which it won't be right away, it will not. If your story is good, if there's something good there, it will be meaningful. Maybe not in the way you expect, but it will be okay. People feel a lot of pressure to make sure that you understand what they're trying to say, that, you get something out of it. And I understand that pressure because I feel that constantly. Because we hear every single day, writing is this meaningful, noble thing, and you're saying so much to so many people. And so that kind of builds up the pressure to create something that lives up to that. When really you can do that just by creating and just by focus on making it a good story first. Mm-hmm. Are your characters good? Is your plot good? Is it something that people enjoy reading? If it is, I can guarantee you there will be something to say in there, and you can find that as you go. But just start doing something that you like.
Well, there's always that little bit of advice that, at least I've heard people say to write from experience, write what you know, at least. And I think that kind of goes back to a little bit about being, just be honest, right? Just start from an honest place. Don't try to make it too big. Just write something that's on your heart. And it's going to follow afterwards. That's good advice. Carly, did you have any other questions before I finish off with our outro? Or did you kind of mention...
That was the last question.
I came in at a bad spot. That was the last question. Right. Okay, cool. Thank you, Aimee. This has been really insightful. I know that you have so much more to say. Maybe one day we'll have you back on the show. That would be awesome. Convictions are so crucial to what we create, and it's so important that we have them lined up while we're making something honest and awesome. They can really make or break a story, and they can certainly affect those who are consuming the media that we're putting out.
If you'd like to stalk Aimee on social media, then you can find her on Twitter at the Aimee Meester, on Instagram at Barricade of Books, and of course take a look at her upcoming podcast on Twitter at Bright Eyes Pod.
If you're into busting up fables, then you can subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Tumblr, Instagram, we're on Facebook, we're on Twitter, we're everywhere, all at Fablebreakers. And that'll do it for today's episode. I'm your host, Jake Romano.
And I'm Carly Racklin, and you've been listening to Fablebreakers.